Absolutely, just go ahead.
Okay, so before we begin our meeting, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia, recognise their continuing connection to the land, to water and to culture, and pay my and our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So today's international research webinar is to be given by Rana Mitter, Professor of various things, including history and China studies at the University at Oxford. If you had to ask anybody in the world who would you like to be your modern Chinese historian in your department, I think probably 99.8% of the people you asked would say Rana Mitter. And so we're very pleased that he's come to talk about nationalism in the new China. I'm not going to say anything more about him. I would, though, like to remind you who are listening that if you'd like to ask a question at the end, please indicate through the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen what your question is, and I'll pose it to the speaker. We find this a better way of organising things. Rana's going to speak for about half an hour to 40 minutes, and there'll be a time for questions afterwards. Over to you, Rana.
David, thank you very much. First of all, for that very typically generous, overly generous, I suspect, introduction on your part, and also on my part with very, very happy memories now some years ago of a visit to your centre in Sydney, where we were able to do this in the much preferable way, of course, of being in person and having a chance to have a glass of wine afterwards. Since it's, of course, actually just 8:35 in the morning for me here in England, I will prove visually as well, drinking coffee, not wine at the moment, but I hope all of you are opening a tin, having a glass, or even trying out a cocktail as Sydney begins to unlock. What I'd like to do is to speak for about half an hour or so with some thoughts based on a book I published about a year ago, China's Good War, which examines and asks questions about the way in which China relates to its collective and social memory of perhaps the one global event, at least for the Northern Hemisphere, that seems to combine almost all of us, and that's World War II, over, long before the lifetimes of most people listening even began, and yet somehow looming in our memory. And Australia, although of course not in the Northern Hemisphere, is by no means absent from that type of global memory. And in doing that, I want to lay out a few thoughts, and then I'm sure, knowing the typical Sydney audience, will have plenty of questions, thoughts, comments, and I want to leave 20 minutes or so near the end for a chance to talk about that as well. So I will try and make sure that I keep my comments relatively concise. What I want to do is to start with a couple of images and then give you a little bit of text, which will set the scene for what I want to say. And let me show the images first, which give a little idea of some of the context, some of the background for the wider point that I'm going to make in just a couple of minutes. So let's start with this. He says, hoping that he can get the screen share to work. There we go. Yes, excellent. A few of you, if you have medium terms, not necessarily long memories, but longish memories, and a fondness for HBO miniseries, might remember this television show, which was shown across much of the Western world just over a decade ago, in the year 2010. It's The Pacific, made by the Hollywood power team of Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg, a successor to the actually probably rather bigger hit they had before, which is Band of Brothers, which portrayed the European war through American military eyes. And this is a sort of follow-up in which a contingent of US Marines found themselves fighting their way across the Pacific in the last couple of years of the Second World War in Asia. It was certainly a success and critically quite well acclaimed. Now, in the same year, Chinese audiences got to see this. Dongfeng Yu. If you haven't seen it, I'd certainly suggest giving it a go. It is a pretty robust, well-written and highly entertaining thriller made with, amongst other things, first appearance from a then only sort of rising figure in the Chinese movie universe, Fan Bingbing, who went on to become famous not only for her major movie roles, but also for her slightly complicated tax affairs. We won't say more about that at the moment, I think. But this film did some pretty good box office, and it's based on an interesting storyline that essentially just before Pearl Harbor, just before December 1941, the Chinese Communist underground intelligence, the Dixia, in Hong Kong, managed to find various bits of evidence that, in fact, the Japanese are going to bomb Pearl Harbor. They're going to bomb Hawaii, and they managed to smuggle this information all the way to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in Washington, no less. But of course, the Americans, being the Americans, don't listen to a word of it. And of course, Pearl Harbor is bombed, and World War II in Asia expands. Leading, of course, to a highly patriotic conclusion from the point of view of the Chinese side, but also a historically tenable outcome by which you still get World War II breaking out. I should add, by the way, in the interests of historical accuracy, just in case it's not clear, while it's a wonderful story, there is absolutely zero evidence that there is any truth to this story whatsoever. There is no evidence that Chinese communist underground figures were passing information to FDR, although, of course, there is a wider story about the Tokyo spy ring, Richard Sorge and others, which is better known and very exciting in its own right. Okay, so let me stop sharing for just a moment so I can read a little bit to you, if I may, and then we'll come back to some images in a moment. Please have in mind, therefore, the year 2010, just over a decade ago, when these two productions, one movie, The East Wind Rain, and one television series, The Pacific, appeared on screens in the Western world and in China. And I should say that, of course, as is often the way, The Pacific was also quite widely viewed in China. I think possibly not an entirely legally acquired version, although again, I wouldn't want to cast any aspersions, whereas I don't think the Chinese movie was very well viewed in the Western world. So a slight imbalance there, one has to say. But I want to read you a bit now from a blog piece. And again, I talk about this in the book in more detail, but no reason why you should have read the book. So let me get this out to you. That a couple of well-known bloggers, still quite well-known actually, but very big at that time. One of them is Pingman, who you might know as, I mean, I'm using sort of very crude characterization, but a sort of neo-Maoist, quite, new left type commentator, very sharp, very thoughtful on politics. And he and a co-author wrote a big long blog in which they used these two productions, the Dongfeng Yu movie and the Pacific television series, as evidence in a piece which is titled, so again, my translations here, the title is, Why Are China and the US Both Rewriting the History of the Pacific War? And analyzing both fictional works, the writers of this blog detect a wider discourse in both countries to claim a political legacy from the wartime years. And so here I'm quoting, again, in my translation from them. They say, if you peel below the surface of these stories of justice and heroism, then there is this hidden tendency towards conspiracy and competition in their own interests. And then stop quote, on the Chinese side, they suggest, although East Wind Rain is not sort of overtly nationalistic, they compare it, and because I'm speaking, I know, to a China studies audience in large part, many of you will know the famous book by Song Qiang and the others called 中国不高兴, which was a sequel to 中国可以说不 and the even more kind of rip-roaring 中国还可以说不. So there was a lot of unhappiness in the late 90s, early 2000s. David, of course, knows this work very, very well. So it's not like that, they're saying. It's much subtler, but it's still this movie trying to give China the upper rhetorical hand, suggesting Pearl Harbor was an American failure that could have been solved by heeding Chinese advice, even though, of course, this advice is entirely fictional in the film. But there is a wider view, which is, it takes from that, a rejection of the view that China was just a victim during the war, waiting to be saved by the Americans. And then on the Pacific, they turn their attention, these bloggers, to the Pacific. And they say on that, quote, this series says, because the Americans saved people from the claws of the demon Japanese, their term, not mine, I hasten to add, and I think even they're using it somewhat ironically, saved people from the claws of the demon Japanese. That's why the US now gets to have the strongest army in the world. And the conclusion of their piece, I think, is almost more resonant 10, 11 years later than it was even when they wrote it. So they say, the release of these two films is not just about their plots or their performances. Just as the United States lets the world know that at a most dangerous time for humanity, it bore burdens and made sacrifices, so China finally has dared to propagate in the same way that during the war, it also bore burdens and sacrifices. This represents another type of the continuity of the competition over politics, economics, and culture of these two countries, close quote. So that's 2010. But I think if there's one way we could characterize the growing tensions in global society at the moment, particularly between the United States and its Western allies, of which Australia, of course, is one, and the UK is certainly another, and the world that surrounds China, then the idea of competition over politics, economics, and culture of these two countries, plus allies, is, I think, even more appropriate description 10 years on than it was when they first wrote those words. And the point that I want to drive home today is that the changing social memory of war has significantly shaped China's international relations, particularly in the 21st century. So these films aren't just important as films, they're important as manifestations of a much wider cultural phenomenon that spreads everywhere from the diplomatic negotiating chamber to, indeed, the movie theatre or the television screen. I say this part because there's a common assumption that the Second World War conflict in China's self-definition today relates almost exclusively to its relationship with Japan. And of course, that very troubled encounter, the Sino-Japanese encounter, is still very relevant for all sorts of reasons that, again, this grouping knows very, very well. But I would also add that with more and more certitude, as the United States clearly moves into pole position as the primary global opponent, adversary, counterpart, whatever you want to call it, for China in the wider world, the Second World War is also taking a greater role in terms of China's self-presentation in its rhetorical battle with America. And that relates to a couple of issues. One is China's own position in international order, but also an impetus to create a story about China, a narrative about China and its point of origin into the modern world, the post-1945 international order, that's not just about China's power, whether as a military or economic actor, but about its moral standing. And that is something that is much harder to achieve. The Belt and Road Initiative is supposed to be part of it in terms of handing out infrastructure and rolling out vaccines. That, of course, has a kind of present day value. But the wider moral basis on which the Western presence in Asia stands as a result of the blood and treasure lost in World War II is something that China is increasingly laying claim to in its domestic discourse and is keen to spread at an international level, but so far has done so with relatively limited success at best. Another point, since I know I also have historians in the audience, historians of China and historians elsewhere, is that this is not wholly new. I know it's a tick of historians, probably not David, who I'm sure is much too smart to do this, but to always say nothing is really new. And we go back to the Song Dynasty or before to say that it's all been happening there. But in this sense, actually, even in the recent past, if you look for it, you can find traces of what has become this much stronger discourse about the significance of World War II in China's wartime experience. So just to very briefly mention, I know that many here will be very expert on this, but just to give a brief outline, what that wartime experience is that is being remembered. Because again, in Australia's own very distinct memory of the Second World War, of course, still stands as part of the national discourse. Those of you who know Britain, that's many of you here, will know that we still have our own rather kind of, in some ways, dependent relationship on the memory of the Second World War. But China's experience, let alone its memory, isn't still always very well known in the Western world. So a reminder that, depending on how you look at the statistics, 10 million deaths, not all by any means caused directly by battle, but through the consequences of war, is not an unreasonable number to think of in terms of casualties of World War II in China, including issues such as the 4 million dead in the Henan famine of 1942, certainly caused directly by the impact of the war experience. Also, the destruction of China's very flawed but carefully won modernization of the early 20th century, which is essentially smashed into pieces by war, conflict, and bombing. And also not by any means without consequence for the wider global war effort, the Allied war effort of later years, holding down over 500,000 Japanese troops for 4.5 years in a China quagmire. So this is a very significant conflict, but one that is not, I think, well known as a theatre of the Second World War in the way that other theatres of war, even the Pacific theatre, tend to be in the Western world. And this sort of sense, I think, of absence is one of the things that motivated at least some of the people looking to reconstitute China's sense of national identity in the post-Mao years starting in the 1980s. And I'm thinking here of people like the veteran communist politician, insider, and historian, to be fair, Hu Qiaomu, amongst other things, Mao's personal secretary. And he wrote in 1987 in the People's Daily about what he called the immense significance of the war of resistance against Japan. As most of you, I'm sure, will know, the terminology that's still used for China's theater of World War II against the Japanese within China itself. And Hu Qiaomu said during that time that one great significance of the war of resistance, this is in the People's Daily in 1987, one great significance of that war of resistance is that it fundamentally changed the international politics of the Far East. He goes on to say, before the conclusion of the 8 years of the war, Japanese imperialism was on the rampage. But then in 1945, he says, the Soviet army eliminated the Guangdong army in Korea, and following the atomic bombings of Japan, Japan then instituted a peace constitution, while new powers, including China, actually got to sit in judgment on Japan at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. And then he reaches the end of this sort of peroration in the People's Daily, where he says, just a year later, the People's Republic of China declared its foundation. The old China that was called the sick man of East Asia would not return. At the same time, the old structure of the Far East and the old structure of the world would not return. And Hu Jiaomu's statement that a large part of the war's significance was to do with the new shaping of international order was important, even though it wasn't immediately obvious why, I think, at the time. I think it was important because it framed the end of World War II as a point of origin for the contemporary international system in a way that the People's Republic of China would accept and embrace. To put it its most crude, and this is overly simplistic, making year zero, not just 1949, we all know why 1949 is year zero for the Chinese Communist Revolution, but 1945 back into the story as well. Remember some of Hu Qiaomu's high points that I just mentioned in that quick summary of his piece. The presence of Mei Ru'ao, the Chinese judge appointed by the Kuomintang nationalist government at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. Those sorts of events are, of course, the participation in the formation of Japan's peace constitution, in which the nationalist foreign minister Wang Shijie was very much involved. These were all things that happened, of course, before the establishment of the PRC, but also a sign of a trend that emerges much more strongly in the years following the 80s, and which I track quite closely in the book, which is the unacknowledged, I mean, not explicitly acknowledged, but very, very clear rehabilitation of the formerly completely out of court nationalist Kuomintang government and their contribution to winning the war against the Japanese. And this was done not through some sudden fit of historical altruism by the Chinese Communist Party, but rather because it enabled them to create a new discourse, still very much in use today, that China, including both nationalists and communists, of course, was, to adapt Dean Acheson, the US Secretary of State's famous phrase in his memoirs, present at the creation. That is, present at the creation of the contemporary international order that we still live with one way or another. And in doing that, a trend emerged, and in a moment I'll show you a couple of images to show what I mean by that, in which there was the possibility of making use of this new expanded version of World War II and its meaning to pursue contemporary goals in the Chinese Communist Party's contemporary interest. In other words, prior to that, the vast majority of the discourse around China's World War II experience within mainland China was, understandably, the story of how the Chinese communists had resisted the Japanese, but almost nobody, certainly not the Kuomintang and not the Americans, and not actually for that long the Soviet Union either, were included in that bigger story. 1980s marks the beginning of the opening up of that story, in which all of those elements, the British Empire too, I should say, have been slowly brought in to that story in a much bigger sort of a way. So let me return for a moment to sharing a couple of images. I'll get to that to show where we go with that. Yes, okay, let me do that. Sorry, it was from current slide. There we go. So that was East Wind Rain. Yeah, so just a quick slide there on World War II in China, sort of summary of some of the horrific numbers that people do put out there on it. An image there of Chiang Kai-shek, China's national leader, as I say, very much cut out of history during Mao's period in power, now brought back into the fold, historically speaking, from the 1980s onwards. And there, the ability to bring in post-1945 rather than post-1949 events into the history of international order that China tells about itself enables it to bring in also this signing ceremony at San Francisco for the first United Nations Charter, which I'm sure you will know was, of course, primarily led by China's nationalist Song Zewen, the brother-in-law of Chiang Kai-shek and prime minister at the time, leading the delegation, but also with one communist member there too, Dong Biwu, who would go on to become president of the PRC, I think, in fact, in later years, but was the single CCP representative who was very much there in person at San Francisco for that opening moment for the post-1945 world order. And there's an image of Hu Qiaomo, who I had mentioned through his People's Daily editorial. So let me use this image now, if I may, to talk a little bit about some of the consequence of this, because what we see in the fast forwarding of those decades between the 1980s when Hu Qiaomo is writing and the 2000s and 2010s, which is the period that I've been most concerned with in writing this book, is an explosion of interest in World War II as a phenomenon in China itself. And in this short talk, I don't have time to talk about all the things that I do discuss in more detail in the book. The way in which museums have been built to both by the state and also by amateurs to showcase different aspects of collective memory, how oral history, videos, all of these sorts of things have been put together in a way that tries to preserve popular memories of World War II, while some of the now very elderly people are still alive, in a way that simply couldn't be done under Mao, because many of the people involved had lived in the Kuomintang nationalist zone in southwest China, rather than in Yan'an, the communist zone, during the wartime years. And so for many eras, their stories were discounted. Now they have been recorded, they have been broadcast, they have been preserved. And that's a real shift in terms of the way in which that wartime experience is preserved in China. But I'm sticking today to talking about some of the kind of international implications of this. And the one case study I want to give you in 2 or 3 dimensions is what I call in the book the Cairo syndrome. I explain what I mean, why the capital of Egypt has anything to do with any of this. So this is an image of one of the summit conferences of World War II. You'll be aware, I'm sure, that the major Allied leaders met with each other on various occasions, usually at slightly difficult to access locations at various points during the Second World War, Tehran being one famous one, Quebec being another. And mostly these meetings were held between Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. However, in this particular case, in November 1943, the personnel was slightly different. As you see, we have FDR, we have Winston Churchill, but we also have, from our point of view here, the left-hand side, Chiang Kai-shek, and on the other side, Sung Mei-ling, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, China's voice to the world, you might say, during that period, at least at the elite level. Now, although the Cairo conference didn't actually decide very much in terms of strategy, most of what was decided there was reversed pretty quickly when they met Stalin at Tehran a couple of weeks later. Well, Chiang didn't meet him because, of course, the Soviet Union, as you remember, was neutral against Japan during this period of the war. It wasn't in the war against Japan. But what happened at this point was symbolically extremely important. The bringing of a Chinese leader on equal status with the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the British Empire, all simultaneously sitting in full array as wartime allies. And for China, this was really a transformative moment in terms of presence on the world stage, and for Chiang Kai-shek himself. Now, this is an event that wasn't really mentioned with any kind of great assiduity through most of Mao's period. You know, it wasn't very relevant to Mao's vision of China's place in the world. But certainly in the 2010s, and on the 70th anniversary of the conference in 2013, there was a great deal of discussion on Chinese social media and in diplomatic circles about the Cairo conference. Why? Well, partly it was about remembering this time when China stood shoulder to shoulder with the British and the Americans to fight the Axis. So that sort of moral standing that China is seeking from its participation in World War II, 70 years on was part of it. But there's a more practical reason as well. Let me stop sharing for a moment and again, read you a bit of a document. This is a brief quotation from the document that the three leaders, Chiang, FDR, or Churchill, put out at the end of that conference. And it was issued just at the end of November 2013, 1943, as 70th anniversary was in 2013. And the communique said, until a new order is established, until there is convincing proof that Japan's war-making power is destroyed, points in Japanese territory to be designated by the Allies shall be occupied to secure the achievement of the basic objectives we're here setting forth. And then here's the killer line. The terms of this Cairo Declaration shall be carried out, and Japanese sovereignty shall be limited to the islands of Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, Shikoku, and such minor islands as we determine. Now, without going into, and I'm certainly not going to take a position on it here, but I'm sure many will be aware that the islands known to the Japanese as Senkaku, to the Chinese PRC as Diaoyu, and to the Taiwan Republic of China as Diaoyutai, are heavily disputed. And this particular document, the Cairo Declaration, has been used with great force by Chinese diplomats and lawyers to make the case that actually these islands ought to belong to China. Oh dear, sorry about that. Speakers English is not very easy to follow for Chinese, someone says. I'll have to be a bit slower in that case. Or I hope people will listen back if they like to the recording in that case. Okay, I will do my best to go as clearly and slowly as possible. So that Cairo Declaration has been used extensively by the Chinese diplomatic community to make the case that there is a cast iron case written in 1943 to argue that China should have possession of those islands. Japan, of course, entirely disputes this. I think the last time I checked, the United States does not actually take an official position on this particular issue. But the wider issue still stands, which is that World War II experiences, in particular those undertaken by the Kuomintang nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, is one that is still being drawn on very, very heavily by the, today's PRC. So that's one way in which the Cairo Conference has a presence in terms of the reinsertion of World War II experience into the world of contemporary diplomacy. But that's not the only place in which this event has a kind of wider standing. So in the couple of years that follows, there was also a major blockbuster movie that was made around Cairo Declaration. Again, it's a bit stodgy, but it's not bad. Well worth having a look at to get a take on how a diplomatic argument can be made into a motion picture. But this film also caused a certain amount of amusement on the Chinese internet, because as you'll see from this poster of the movie, various key players in 1943 are displayed here. We have Winston Churchill there on the right-hand side, Joseph Stalin at the back, and the Chinese figure you see with the Kuomintang star is not Chiang Kai-shek. It is in fact He Yin-chin. But in the middle you have Mao Zedong. Now Mao Zedong, of course, was not in Cairo in 1943. He was in the caves in Yan'an. So what's he doing in this movie about Cairo? And many of the more sardonically minded figures on the Chinese internet not only asked this question, but came up with some of these rather splendid alternative versions of the movie poster, in which you see that various figures ranging from Jack Ma to Barack Obama to Colonel Gaddafi also appeared in the Cairo Declaration film. In other words, the Chinese internet was mocking the filmmakers for being sort of, more red than the party itself by trying to insert Mao Zedong slightly, sort of randomly into a film about a subject where he wasn't really relevant. And obviously the presence of Chiang Kai-shek, who does appear actually quite in the movie quite extensively, as does Franklin D. Roosevelt, isn't really portrayed in that poster. But it does suggest this wider issue that just because the state, or those who think they're trying to please the state, put forward a vision of the correct usage of this type of collective World War II memory. As these sarcastic posters show, it doesn't mean that everyone in that wider social media and public community necessarily agrees with that particular interpretation. So let's take a few minutes near the end just to take a few other examples of how I think this wider sense of the World War II experience is shaping China's international image in particular. Perhaps the best example is the one that China's victory parade, when China held its victory parade in Tiananmen Square on 3rd of September 2015, just over 6 years ago. And this was a unique event in all sorts of ways. One was that it's really been the only occasion, I think, when a central government organized Tiananmen Square parade of this sort commemorated an event which was not wholly to do with an anniversary either of the CCP or the PRC. And in fact, during the parade, along with all the marching soldiers and weaponry, various veteran, very ancient 90-year-old plus soldiers of both the communist armies and the nationalist Kuomintang armies were presented to Xi Jinping as part of the ceremony. And that was clearly meant as a gesture of reconciliation in this context between the two sides, and quite an important one as well. It happened at a time when relations also across the straits with Taiwan were somewhat warmer than they are at the moment. So that, is one way in which literally at the center, at the heart of the nation, World War II was brought in as part of that national story in a more inclusive way, not just the communist experience, but the wider experience as well. There are also other maritime disputes. 1947, everyone here I'm sure will be aware of the many disputes around the South China Sea and the 11 or 9-dash line, depending where you start. Worth noting that, of course, one of the many areas in which the dispute began was in 1947 as part of the post-war settlement, where the Kuomintang, not the CCP in this case, began to press quite heavily a claim that in part they saw as their due because of the sacrifices that China had made during World War II. Now it was seen that as a kind of newly emergent global actor, China would have to be given more status in terms of determining its own borders. Of course, the Kuomintang government didn't last long enough to be able to stress that element of what it wanted to put forward. But you might argue that today's Chinese Communist Party is cashing a check that was originally written by Chiang Kai-shek's government back in the 1940s, along, of course, with issues such as China's P5, permanent 5 member seat in the UN Security Council, which again was awarded under Chiang Kai-shek, but of course has been taken over since 1971 by the government of the PRC. And it's also worth noting that not all the stories that get told necessarily bring in aspects of World War II in a way that the Chinese would like. And this example I use here is to me, one of the most interesting examples of when the potential to tell a positive story has actually been pushed away. It's quite intriguing to me. So for a while, various people, both in China and outside, were talking about the Belt and Road Initiative, which you all know about, as the new Marshall Plan. I'm sure you may have even heard that comparison, but you don't hear that very much anymore. And that's largely because the Chinese state officially put out statements, after about 2 or 3 years saying the Belt and Road is no Marshall Plan of China. Now, why is this strange? Because actually, if you think about it, one of the things that China has been desperate to do for years and years now is to find some sort of positive narrative about itself in the wider world. And it's not, frankly, done a very good job. I think most Chinese diplomats I talk to would acknowledge that in private, if not always in public. Perhaps a bit better in the global south, but even there, it's a very transactional relationship rather than being particularly warm. And the global north, particularly places like Australia, it's clearly very, very rocky. But the Marshall Plan, at least for the liberal West, is one of the products of the post-World War II experience that actually has a very positive image around it. Maybe not if you're a diehard, Stalinist in Eastern Europe, but in general, the Marshall Plan is regarded as broadly an act of enlightened self-interest or altruism, depending which way you look at it, that helped to create stable democracies in Western Europe. And therefore, China being able to label its plan as a Marshall Plan might, in terms of international propaganda, have been very useful. But China's propaganda ministry came down absolutely firmly against it. And of course, for those who know Chinese history, the reason actually isn't all that hard to divine. General Marshall, who you can see there looming over Harry Truman in the picture, is not regarded as a figure of great standing in China, largely because he sought to negotiate with, I think great honesty, but not much success, the civil war between the Chinese and the Chinese communists and nationalists in 1946, before having to leave essentially empty-handed as the civil war broke out. Marshall, as in many of the more scathing essays of Mao Zedong, is regarded as sort of tool of Western Cold War imperialism on the American side, and therefore rehabilitating his name is going to be a hard sell within China. So in this case, you have an example actually of a kind of World War II related image, the Marshall Plan, that potentially could have done a lot of good for China, but which was actively rejected because of its internal Chinese associations, which the party even now, 70 plus years later, found unacceptable from its point of view. So there's plenty more I could say, and indeed have said in the book on a variety of topics I haven't even had a chance to touch on here. But broadly speaking, I hope this has given a few ideas of the way that we will have the range and the often kind of very different valencies of the way in which that World War II experience has shaped China in the present day. Just to use as a final thought, just a few examples from the year that's just gone past, the pandemic year, 2020, 2021, to talk about how that war turns up in unexpected places. Started at the beginning of the year, even before the pandemic began, when Foreign Minister Wang Yi went to the Munich Security Conference, many other international places as well, and talked about China as not just a signatory, but the first signatory to the United Nations Charter. In other words, planting the flag right into the heart of that ownership claim of being present at the creation of the international order in 1945. Another example, when the virus broke out, is again the phrase that's brought out in many places, but it's definitely a wartime phrase, which is the People's War, 人民战争, in which a people's war against the virus was being propagated, just as, of course, it had been by Mao against the Japanese many years earlier. And a final example, but an intriguing one, the best-selling movie in China, and probably in the world, actually, in 2020 was the movie Babai, the 800, about a group of brave Chinese soldiers fighting off Japanese invaders. But of course, those soldiers were not CCP soldiers. They were not Balujun or Xin Shijun. They were Kuomintang soldiers, the 37th Division of the Kuomintang in the Sihang warehouse in Shanghai. And that movie, as many of you will know, was banned in the summer of 2019 when it was originally slated for showing, because people high up in the Chinese propaganda authorities found it impossible to allow a movie that praised the Kuomintang's anti-Japanese activities, fighting, in the 70th anniversary of the founding of the PRC. But a year later, on the 75th anniversary of victory over Japan, this huge big budget movie proved suitable for release. And in fact, as I said, took $300 million at the box office, a sign that whatever else you might say about World War II in China, it is A, both big box office, and B, still has a tremendous audience if you know how to phrase it and where to look. And speaking of tremendous audiences, you have been one so far. I look forward to you becoming an active conversational audience. So thank you very much indeed, David. May I hand back to you so we can have some conversation for 15, 20 minutes?
You can indeed, and thank you very much indeed.